Hello world, what a wallow. My name is Zaleva, and for as long as I can remember, I lived in the shadow of my father's pride. At his retirement party, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and family, he raised his glass and said, "Only the daughters who made me proud are truly mine." The room erupted with applause, but my heart sank as he turned to me and added, "You don't belong here." I felt my chest tighten, every muscle in my body screaming with humiliation and disbelief. The whispers around me grew louder, and I could see the judgment in the eyes of people I had once considered allies. The daughter he was supposed to cherish, the one who had sacrificed so much for him, was suddenly erased from his world, dismissed in front of everyone. My hand shook, but I forced myself to breathe. My husband, sensing the storm of emotions, rose beside me with a quiet determination that steadied me. What he did next stunned everyone. Wonderful day to be a text-to-speech model. With a calmness that cut through the tension, he placed his hand on mine and said, "You are exactly where you belong, and he will see that soon." In that instant, a spark ignited within me. I realized that humiliation could be transformed into power, that betrayal could be molded into a plan that would leave my father unrecognizable to the people who once admired him blindly. In the days that followed, I observed my father more closely than ever before. His arrogance, once untouchable, now revealed cracks I had never noticed. Every word he spoke, every gesture, every glance carried the shadow of control, of a man who believed he could manipulate not just my life, but my reputation. And yet, I saw the opportunity. I began documenting every slight, every insult, every maneuver that had been designed to diminish me. Slowly, methodically, I started crafting a path to make the world see him as I had always seen him: flawed, controlling, and deeply vulnerable. I reached out to people who had witnessed his cruelty, former colleagues, family, friends, anyone who had experienced his manipulations. With each story, each account, the pieces of a larger truth began to assemble in my mind. I realized revenge isn't about shouting, it's about strategy, timing, and patience. I would not let him see me unravel in anger. I would let the truth emerge like a tide, unstoppable, undeniable, and shattering to the foundation of his carefully constructed image. By the end of that first week, I understood something profound. Revenge is not an act, it's an art. It's the delicate manipulation of truth, the patient orchestration of events, and the unwavering resolve to turn betrayal into victory. And as I looked at my reflection that night, I saw not a victim, but a woman ready to reclaim her dignity, ready to make my father and the world understand that no one who tries to humiliate me will ever succeed. The next morning, I woke with a strange mixture of anger and clarity. Every glance I had received at that party replayed in my mind, every whispered comment echoing like a drumbeat demanding attention. My father's words weren't just a casual insult, they were a declaration, a public erasure that stung deeper than I could have imagined. But that sting quickly turned into resolve. I realized that the humiliation I had felt could become my greatest weapon if I played my cards carefully, and I wasn't about to waste this chance to reclaim what was mine. I started small, reestablishing my presence in places he thought I had no right to be. I attended family events with calm composure, each appearance a subtle reminder that I was still here, still visible, and still unbroken. People noticed the difference in me, the quiet confidence, the determination that radiated from every step, every gesture. My father, of course, tried to dismiss it, to wave me off with condescending remarks, but I had learned to observe silently, to let his impatience and arrogance expose him. Every reaction he had was a piece of the puzzle I was assembling, a thread I could pull to unravel his facade completely. Meanwhile, my husband and I began collecting evidence, testimonies, and proof of every manipulation, every lie, every cruel act my father had hidden over the years. It wasn't enough to confront him privately. This needed to be undeniable, public, and shocking. I reached out to people he had wronged, quietly encouraging them to share their stories without revealing my hand. The more I listened, the clearer it became. My father had spent decades building an empire of control, but each brick of that empire was made from lies and fear, and I was about to dismantle it piece by piece. One evening, I found myself staring at old family photos, remembering moments when I had been dismissed, overlooked, and belittled. The girl who had once sought his approval had grown into a woman who demanded justice. I felt a fire ignite within me, a mix of sorrow, rage, and determination. I realized that revenge wasn't just about him. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and showing the world that no one has the right to erase you. The most important lesson I learned during those first days was patience. Every encounter, every conversation, every public appearance had to be orchestrated carefully. I had to wait for the right moment, let his arrogance and overconfidence play against him, and make sure the reveal would leave no room for denial. It wasn't just about exposing him, it was about showing him that the daughter he thought he could humiliate had grown stronger, smarter, and unstoppable. By the end of that week, I realized I had taken the first step. The whispers were now tinged with curiosity rather than judgment, and I could see people starting to notice that something had shifted. My father still commanded a presence, but it was brittle now, fragile, and I knew deep in my bones that this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would leave him questioning everything he thought he controlled. Weeks passed, and my father's subtle dismissals began to feel more like cracks than walls. Every time he tried to belittle me in front of family or colleagues, I met his gaze calmly, refusing to shrink or apologize for existing. My husband remained my anchor, quietly guiding me, reminding me that patience was our weapon. I realized revenge isn't a sudden act, it's a slow burn, a meticulous orchestration of timing, perception, and precision. And I had all the time in the world. I started gathering more than just testimonies. I collected tangible proof, emails, messages, contracts, and photographs. Every piece of evidence revealed the manipulations my father had orchestrated to maintain control and superiority. Every lie he had spun over the years now had a trail, a pattern, a vulnerability I could exploit. But this wasn't about public shaming for the sake of it. It was about reclaiming the power that had been stolen from me, showing him and everyone else that the daughter he thought he could dismiss had grown stronger than he ever imagined. The tension at home and at family gatherings became almost unbearable for him. I noticed the subtle signs, the way his voice faltered when he realized I wasn't afraid, the forced politeness in his greetings, the way he studied my every move. He had underestimated me for decades, believing that conformity and submission were the only ways I could survive in his world. But he had never accounted for the quiet rage that burns beneath the surface, the determination that transforms hurt into strategy. One afternoon, I attended a charity event he had proudly sponsored. He flaunted his connections, his influence, his control, and yet, as I mingled and subtly engaged with the people he had wronged, I could see the tension mounting. Friends and associates I had reached out to shared glances, small acknowledgments, whispers that I couldn't quite hear but that I knew were in my favor. It was the first time I saw him truly unsettled in a public setting, and a thrill surged through me. This was the beginning of turning his arrogance against him. Late that night, my husband and I reviewed every interaction, every subtle response, every reaction. It was clear the foundation of his power was cracking. I could feel it in the air, in the way he glanced nervously, in the way his smile no longer held the confidence it once did. And I understood fully then that the path I had chosen was no longer just about revenge. It was about survival, dignity, and finally taking the life I deserved. By the end of the week, I realized I had achieved something critical. I had become untouchable in my own right. My father could try to intimidate me, manipulate me, or erase me, but he no longer had that power. And as I stared at my reflection that night, I understood with absolute certainty the daughter he had tried to humiliate was now preparing to take back everything he had attempted to control, and the reckoning would be spectacular. The next few weeks became a calculated game. Every word my father spoke, every gathering he attended became an opportunity to observe, to record, to collect proof of his arrogance and manipulations. I no longer felt the sting of his humiliation. It had transformed into laser-focused determination. I understood that revenge isn't about immediate gratification. It's about patience, precision, and letting the right moment unfold. And that moment was coming. I began to reconnect with people he had alienated, allies he had dismissed, and associates he had belittled. I listened, I empathized, and I documented. Slowly, the truth began to form a mosaic, an unbreakable web that would eventually ensnare him in a way he could never manipulate or escape. It was intoxicating to realize that every slight he had ever inflicted, every sneer and dismissive comment had left breadcrumbs that could now be traced, exposed, and amplified. Family events became my stage. He would flaunt his control, attempt to assert superiority, and charm the audience as he always had. And yet, beneath his rehearsed smiles, I could see the tension creeping in. Subtle glances, fleeting hesitations, a quickening of the pulse in his hands. These were signs that the power dynamic was shifting. I remained composed, projecting calm and dignity, while quietly preparing to reveal the storm that had been quietly gathering beneath the surface. I also learned the importance of alliances. There were people he had underestimated, friends who had once feared him, colleagues who had once deferred to his ego, who were now quietly watching, waiting for the truth to emerge. I nurtured these relationships carefully, never revealing my hand but planting seeds of awareness. Every small revelation, every subtle question added to the tension, and I could feel the walls of his carefully constructed image beginning to tremble. And then there was the personal side, the inner fire that refused to be extinguished. At night, I would replay every memory, every insult, every time he had made me feel invisible. That fire became a tool, a motivator, a guide for the strategy I was crafting. I realized that revenge isn't about hatred, it's about reclaiming dignity, asserting truth, and exposing lies. And the daughter he thought he could erase would become the instrument of that reckoning. By the end of that month, I knew one thing for certain: the pieces were in place. Every observation, every connection, every careful maneuver had brought me closer to a moment when the truth would no longer be ignored. My father's empire of control, built on fear and arrogance, was fragile, and I, once dismissed and humiliated, was ready to step into the light and ensure that the world would finally see him for who he truly was. By now, every interaction with my father carried a silent electricity. I had learned to listen more than speak, to observe the cracks in his carefully maintained facade. Each smirk, each condescending remark, and every subtle dismissal became fuel for the plan I was quietly orchestrating. The humiliation he had once inflicted no longer hurt. It had been transformed into focus, patience, and resolve. My father had underestimated me for too long, and I was ready to make him realize the magnitude of his miscalculation. I began attending social gatherings and professional events he controlled, all while meticulously planting seeds of doubt about his credibility. Conversations were handled carefully, questions asked subtly, observations shared indirectly. I could sense the unease building around him, though he tried to hide it with practiced charm. It was intoxicating to watch the cracks appear, tiny, almost imperceptible, but growing steadily. I had become a ghost in his world, silent but powerful, observing and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My husband remained my unwavering support, the steady hand guiding me when impatience threatened to cloud my judgment. Together, we reviewed every piece of evidence we had collected, every testimony, every photograph, every document. Each one was a key, a tool, a weapon that would bring the truth into the light in a way that could not be denied. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the dignity and control he had tried to strip from me for decades. The personal side of it was the hardest. Every memory of shame, every moment I had been dismissed or belittled, surfaced with a sharp intensity. And yet, rather than breaking me, it became the source of my strength. I realized that revenge isn't fueled by anger alone. It's fueled by clarity, by vision, and and by the understanding that those who underestimate you can be turned into instruments of their own undoing. My father had built his life on control, on fear, and on the illusion of perfection, but I was about to shatter that illusion piece by piece. I began reaching out quietly to family, friends, distant relatives, and colleagues who had witnessed his manipulations firsthand. Some had been too afraid to speak before. Now, with subtle encouragement, they began to share their truths. Each story I gathered, each confession was a thread weaving into a tapestry of undeniable evidence. And with every new piece, I felt the tension rise, not just in him, but in the world around him. The stage was being set, and he remained oblivious, confident in his control, blind to the reckoning gathering quietly behind the scenes. By the end of the week, I felt a surge of purpose. The daughter he had dismissed, humiliated, and tried to erase was no longer afraid. She was powerful, prepared, and patient. Every careful step had brought me closer to a moment where the world would witness the truth, where the arrogance and manipulation that had defined my father's life would crumble, and where I would finally reclaim everything he had tried to take from me. As the days passed, I realized that my father's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He had always believed he could control everything, manipulate everyone, and maintain a flawless image. But I had discovered the truth. Power built on fear and lies is fragile, and even the smallest crack can grow into a collapse. I had become patient, silent, and strategic, watching him reveal his insecurities without ever needing to confront him openly. Every gathering, every family dinner, and every professional event became an opportunity to observe him. I noticed the subtle tremor in his hands when someone questioned his judgment, the hesitation in his voice when he realized he might be losing influence. He thought he was untouchable, but I could see the slow erosion of his control. It was satisfying, yes, but also a reminder that the ultimate revenge required more than observation. It required execution at the perfect moment, with precision and impact. I continued to gather evidence, more than just words this time. Emails, financial records, and documented accounts from colleagues who had once feared to speak up all formed a comprehensive narrative of his manipulations. Each piece was carefully stored, each story cross-referenced until I had a clear map of how to dismantle the image he had spent decades constructing. I wasn't acting out of spite alone. I was reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my voice in a world where he had tried to erase me. The emotional side of this journey was more complicated than I expected. There were nights I cried alone, replaying the humiliation, the coldness in his eyes, the dismissal I had endured for years. And yet, every tear was a fuel, every memory a reminder that revenge isn't just a response, it's a reclamation. I learned to transform pain into strategy, to convert heartbreak into clarity. With every passing day, I became more resolute, more determined, and more certain that the reckoning would come. I also began to notice the shift in others. Friends and colleagues who had once admired my father without question were now subtly drawn to me, curious, intrigued, and increasingly skeptical of his flawless facade. The tension I had cultivated, the whispers I had subtly nurtured, began to bear fruit. And I realized that revenge doesn't have to be loud to be devastating. Sometimes the quiet, relentless unfolding of truth is far more powerful than any confrontation. By the end of this phase, I understood one thing clearly. The daughter he thought he had silenced was now untouchable. I had learned patience, precision, and the art of strategy. And with every passing day, the stage for the ultimate revelation grew closer. My father would soon witness the consequences of underestimating me, and when that day arrived, it would leave him and everyone who had cheered his dominance utterly stunned. The tension between us grew palpable with every passing day. My father still believed he held the power, still carried himself with that air of untouchable authority, but I could see the cracks he refused to acknowledge. Every time he dismissed me in front of others, I maintained my composure, letting him feel the absence of my fear. That silence, that quiet defiance was becoming more dangerous to him than any argument I could have made. I had learned that sometimes the most effective revenge isn't loud, it's the slow, inevitable shift in perception that leaves the aggressor exposed. I continued to nurture connections with people who had been caught in his web over the years. Family members, distant acquaintances, colleagues. Some had been too intimidated to speak, others had been silently observing, waiting for someone to act. I became that someone. By listening and validating their experiences, I built a network of subtle support that would amplify the eventual exposure. Every shared story, every piece of hidden truth became a tool, a thread in the tapestry of the reckoning I was preparing. At home, my husband remained my steady anchor. Together, we reviewed our plan repeatedly, refining it, ensuring that every step, every reveal would maximize impact. I had learned to balance patience with precision, allowing my father to continue his illusions of control while quietly gathering the ammunition that would shatter them. Each day brought new insights, ways to expose his arrogance, to reveal the manipulations that had once seemed invisible, to ensure that the world would finally see him as he truly was. Emotionally, I felt a mixture of calm and exhilaration. The humiliation I had endured was still a raw memory, but it no longer had power over me. Instead, it had become fuel, a reminder of why I had chosen this path. Revenge, I realized, isn't about hatred. It's about reclaiming the dignity and control that was stolen. It's about showing the world and the person who wronged you that underestimation comes with consequences. And my father, for all his pride, would soon learn that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. By the end of this phase, I felt the weight of inevitability. Every interaction I had, every observation, every subtle influence I exerted was bringing the day of reckoning closer. My father still believed he could dictate the narrative, but he had no idea that the story was already being rewritten, quietly, meticulously, and irreversibly. And I, Aleva, the daughter he thought he could erase, was now the one holding the pen. When the moment finally arrived, it would leave him, and everyone who had ever admired him blindly, utterly speechless. By now, I had become a shadow in my father's world present, yet silent, observing, calculating, and waiting. The anger and humiliation I had once felt had transformed into a cold, precise determination. Every smile he offered, every arrogant remark, every attempt to flaunt his power became fuel for my plan. I realized that the most devastating revenge isn't explosive. It's inevitable, creeping, undeniable, and unavoidable. I started attending more public events he was involved in, subtly engaging with the people he had wronged, nurturing alliances, and planting seeds of doubt. I could see the unease growing within him, though he tried desperately to mask it. His arrogance had always been his shield, but it was beginning to crack under the weight of perception and truth. Every step I took, every word I exchanged was meticulously calculated to undermine him without making it obvious. He remained blind to the storm quietly building around him. At home, my husband and I continued our work, reviewing evidence, coordinating our approach, and planning the perfect timing. We discussed every nuance, every subtle angle, every potential outcome. It wasn't just about exposing him. It was about creating a moment so powerful, so undeniable that it would permanently alter how he was perceived. I realized that revenge is as much an art as it is a strategy. It requires patience, vision, and the ability to endure until the perfect moment arrives. The emotional side of this phase was intense. Memories of humiliation, betrayal, and dismissal haunted me at times, but they no longer paralyzed me. They reminded me of the stakes, of the justice I sought, and of the dignity I was reclaiming. I understood that the anger I had once felt had transformed into something far stronger. Focus, clarity, and the unwavering commitment to ensure that no one, not even my father, could dismiss me again. As I observed him in social circles, I could see the subtle signs of stress, hesitation, repeated checking of his phone, fleeting uncertainty in his eyes. He had always prided himself on reading people, but he could not read me. He had trained me to defer, to bow, to seek approval, but the daughter he had tried to erase had grown into a woman who refused to be controlled, and that realization alone I knew would be the most shocking revelation for him when the time came. By the end of this week, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing closer. I had nurtured alliances, gathered evidence, and observed every weakness in his armor. The daughter he thought he could humiliate, dismiss, and erase was no longer defenseless. She was patient, poised, and ready to strike with precision. And when the moment finally arrived, it would leave him and everyone who had admired him speechless, forced to confront the truth he had hidden for so long. The closer the day of revelation came, the more I noticed the subtle tremors in my father's demeanor. He still smiled, still carried himself with that polished arrogance, but it no longer held the weight it once did. I could see it in his eyes, the unspoken awareness that something had shifted, though he couldn't name it. Every interaction we had became a dance of control, a careful testing of boundaries, and I was the one leading it now. The daughter he thought he had broken was quietly in command. I began reaching out more aggressively to those he had wronged over the years. Former employees, distant relatives, family, friends. Each person I spoke to added a new piece to the puzzle. They shared stories, often shocked that someone finally cared to listen, someone finally validated their experiences. Each revelation I collected, each whispered confession, added layers to the storm I was preparing to unleash. It was a silent revolution, one that he couldn't anticipate because he had never thought me capable of such patience, such precision. My husband and I continued our meticulous planning. Timing was everything, and every detail mattered. I studied the events he planned, the gatherings he valued, and the people he hoped to impress. I realized that the power of exposure lies not just in the truth itself, but in delivering it at a moment that maximizes its impact. When the world would finally see his arrogance, manipulation, and cruelty, it would be undeniable. It would be the reckoning he had so carefully avoided, the one he had never imagined. Emotionally, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and calm. The humiliation I had endured for so long no longer weighed me down. It had transformed into clarity. Every memory of dismissive glances, harsh words, and cold silences became fuel for the strategy I was implementing. Revenge, I realized, is not merely retaliation. It is the reclamation of dignity, the assertion of control, and the ultimate exposure of truth, and I was ready. The subtle shifts in the world around him were unmistakable. People he had relied on for unquestioning support now hesitated, observed, and questioned. The cracks in his network of influence were spreading, and he didn't even realize it. I felt a thrill of anticipation, knowing that every carefully planted seed of awareness, every whispered story, and every piece of evidence would culminate in a moment that he could never control. The daughter he had tried to humiliate, dismiss, and erase would finally stand in the center of the stage, and the world would bear witness. By the end of this phase, I understood fully that patience had been my greatest weapon. The careful observation, the strategic alliances, and the quiet, relentless accumulation of truth had prepared me for the ultimate moment of revelation. My father, for all his pride, would soon experience the shattering of the illusion he had built, and when it happened, there would be no turning back. I was ready to reclaim what had always been mine, and the reckoning would leave everyone stunned. The day of the event finally arrived, a lavish gathering my father had organized, confident that he would dazzle the room with his charm and authority. I arrived quietly, my presence understated, but my eyes were sharp, my mind focused. Every detail had been planned meticulously, every conversation subtly orchestrated to ensure that the moment of truth would land with maximum impact. He didn't notice me at first, too wrapped up in his own ego, too certain that the world still revolved around him. I began interacting with the guests casually, almost innocently, but each exchange carried a purpose. Former colleagues he had wronged, friends who had been intimidated, even distant family members who had witnessed his manipulations, they all responded subtly, their glances, small nods, and hidden smiles. I felt a thrill of anticipation, knowing that the web I had so carefully woven was already starting to take hold, even before a word was spoken. Then came the moment when my father, in full pomp, turned to make a grand announcement. He raised his glass, intending to proclaim pride in his accomplishments and his legacy. But I had prepared carefully evidence, testimonies, subtle reveals, all ready to dismantle the facade he had built for decades. I stepped forward, my husband beside me, our presence commanding yet calm. The room fell into a hush, sensing that something significant was about to happen. I spoke, my voice steady, each word deliberate. I recounted the manipulations, the dismissals, the subtle cruelty that he had inflicted on those around him. I presented evidence that had been carefully collected over months, emails, messages, photographs, and first-hand accounts. The guests, some shocked, some quietly nodding, began to realize the extent of the truth I revealed. I watched as my father's confident mask faltered, the tremor in his hands, the uncertainty in his eyes betraying his panic. The culmination was breathtaking. He, the man who had once tried to erase me, control me, and humiliate me, was now exposed in front of everyone he had ever hoped to impress. The room, once echoing with admiration for him, now absorbed the weight of his actions. His authority, carefully built over decades, crumbled under the undeniable truth. And I, Aleva, the daughter he had dismissed, had reclaimed not only my dignity, but also the power to reshape the narrative of our family and everyone present. By the end of the night, I felt a surge of triumph, tempered with calm satisfaction. Revenge had never been about destruction alone. It was about justice, reclaiming control, and revealing the truth. My father had underestimated me for a lifetime, and now for the first time, he realized the consequences of that mistake. I stood with my husband beside me, watching the shift in the room, knowing that I had orchestrated a reckoning that would be remembered forever. After the event, the world around me felt strangely quiet, like the calm after a storm. My father retreated, no longer the imposing figure he once appeared to be. The room that had been filled with admiration and respect now carried whispers of disbelief, judgment, and shock. I could see the reality sinking in for him. Finally, he understood that his control had been an illusion and that the daughter he had dismissed had been quietly orchestrating his unraveling. People approached me cautiously, offering congratulations, subtle nods, and supportive smiles. Those who had once feared speaking up now quietly validated everything I had revealed. It was an intoxicating mixture of triumph and justice. I realized then that revenge, true revenge, is not only about exposing wrongs, but about giving voice to those who had been silenced, letting the world see the truth and reclaiming one's dignity in the process. My father avoided my gaze, his usual arrogance replaced with an awkward awareness that the balance of power had shifted. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. My presence alone, composed, dignified, and unwavering, was enough to convey that the daughter he had tried to erase was no longer invisible. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle acknowledgement of his flaws amplified the impact of the reckoning I had carefully orchestrated. At home, my husband and I debriefed quietly, reflecting on how far we had come. The months of patience, strategy, and meticulous planning had culminated in a moment that changed everything. Emotionally, I felt a mix of relief, satisfaction, and an almost eerie calm. The pain of past humiliation still lingered, but it no longer had power over me. Instead, it had transformed into proof of my strength, resilience, and ability to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I knew the story wasn't over. Family dynamics rarely are, but the most critical chapter had been written. My father had learned in the most public way possible that underestimating someone can lead to a downfall far greater than any initial humiliation. I had done more than just seek revenge. I had redefined the narrative, restored dignity, and forced truth into a space that had long been dominated by deception. By the end of this chapter, I felt an overwhelming sense of empowerment. The daughter he thought he had silenced had not only survived, but had risen stronger than ever. The reckoning had been delivered, the truth exposed, and the world, including my father, had witnessed it firsthand. And while there were still threads to untangle, conversations to navigate, and reputations to rebuild, I had proven one undeniable fact. Never underestimate the power of a person who has been wronged but refuses to stay silent. The aftermath of that night was surreal. My father, once towering and untouchable in his world, had retreated into a quiet shell of uncertainty. He no longer spoke with the same confidence, no longer commanded the room with that false authority he had relied on for decades. People who had once feared or admired him now viewed him with a cautious distance, and I could see in every glance and whispered conversation that the world finally understood what I had always known. His power had been a facade, and I had dismantled it with patience, precision, and truth. I felt a strange sense of calm as I watched the aftermath of the thought. The strength of the soul was often the humiliation he had once inflicted on me, the dismissive glances, the words meant to belittle, had all been transformed into my strength. The daughter he had thought he could silence had not only survived, but had risen above, orchestrating a reckoning that would be remembered for a lifetime. And yet, it wasn't just revenge, it was a reclamation of dignity, a statement that those who are underestimated and oppressed have the power to change the narrative, to take control, and to make the world witness the truth. My husband stood beside me throughout it all, a quiet anchor in the storm of emotions. Together, we reflected on every step, every carefully laid plan, and every subtle maneuver that had led to this moment. We had turned patience into power, strategy into action, and humiliation into triumph. And in that shared silence, I realized that revenge is not just about hurting someone. It's about revealing truth, reclaiming life, and restoring the balance that had been lost. Even now, weeks later, I can feel the ripple effects of that night. Family gatherings are no longer dominated by his arrogance. Conversations are measured, respect is cautiously extended, and the subtle shift in perception is undeniable. I have reclaimed my voice, my presence, and my power. And as I move forward, I do so with the knowledge that no one can underestimate me again, that no one can dismiss me, and that the reckoning I delivered was not just a moment, it was a turning point that will define my life and the world around me forever. Looking back, I understand that the journey was as much about personal growth as it was about revenge. I discovered patience I didn't know I had, strength I didn't know I could harness, and the courage to stand tall in the face of injustice. The daughter who was once humiliated and dismissed now stands empowered, respected, and in control. And while the scars of the past remain, they no longer define me. They fuel me. If there's one thing I want anyone watching this story to take away, it's this. Never let anyone silence you. Never allow humiliation to define your worth. And always remember that the quiet, patient, and strategic can change everything. My story is proof that even in the face of betrayal, heartbreak, and dismissal, you have the power to reclaim your life and your dignity. And if you want to witness more stories of truth, resilience, and justice, make sure to subscribe, like, and share, because every voice matters and every story deserves to be heard.